you through a little bit of it. So for each region, West Africa, East Africa, Southern Africa, we have the DFI capital on the left and the non-DFI on the right, and it's a proportion of the total capital deployed into different sectors. So for DFIs across the regions, the sectors that have received the most capital are financial services, manufacturing, and energy. Financial services is that top yellow, and then energy will be your blue, and the purple bars are energy. Sorry, did I say? Yeah, manufacturing is blue, energy purple. And then for non-DFIs, there's kind of a wider range of sectors that include financial services and energy as well, but housing and agriculture come into play too. And it's also worth noting that even within the same sector, the types of deals that are made by the DFIs versus the private investors look different. So for example, in the energy sector, a DFI might be making an investment into a renewable energy infrastructure project, whereas a non-DFI or private investor might be looking at making an equity investment into a startup that's working in the off-grid space. Or in financial services, you have DFIs a lot of times lending to commercial banks for the express purpose of on-lending to SMEs. That's kind of their development or impact angle. Whereas for the non-DFIs, they might be looking at investing in an MFI or a fintech company. This also speaks a little bit to the instruments that are used. And so these lovely bubbles are aggregated across all the three regions. And the blue ones are DFIs and the green are non-DFIs. And so it's quite obvious that DFIs have deployed much more of their capital through debt, so like almost all of it. And for non-DFIs, in general, they've used more equity, but there's actually more variation in this from country to country and region to region than there is for the DFIs. So for example, in West Africa, non-DFIs have deployed more of their capital actually through debt than equity. And some of the other circles that aren't labeled are just other instruments like quasi-equity or deals that are a mix of instruments. As you might also expect, the deal sizes vary by investor type. So DFIs look pretty strikingly similar in terms of the breakdown. These are the buckets are, the top one is above 50 million. Then you have 20 to 50 million in the orange, the next one down, 10 to 20, and so on. So more than half of DFI capital in general is in ticket sizes of more than 5 million. Whereas for non-DFIs, see more variation. But in West and East Africa, 60 to 70% of the deals are actually under $1 million. Whereas in Southern Africa, that figure's about 50%. But also worth noting here that this includes tranched investments. So if you're doing a total $4 million deal, but it's in, or total, let's say, $2 million deal in 4 installments of $500,000 each, that's counted as 4 investments under $1 million for this purpose. And I mentioned that our research partners, in addition to collecting all this data, they also did a lot of great qualitative interviews with investors and with other ecosystem actors. So I just want to take a step back from the data for a moment to reflect on some of the kind of overarching common trends and challenges and some related excuse me, opportunities or solutions that are coming up to address those. And here I'll make another plug for going ahead and downloading the reports online, because it's very hard to generalize this across so many countries and the 3 regions. But I'm going to give it a shot and talk about some high-level things. But obviously there's much more detail on all of this that's included in the reports. So the first is a small amount of capital from private and local sources compared to DFIs. So you saw this throughout the presentation, pretty well known. DFIs have been active for the longest in these regions, and as well as providing capital, they play other important roles. So they work with governments on regulatory environments. They set standards for impact measurement. They can sometimes bring down risk and draw in other capital. But what we feel like is a really exciting opportunity is actually the growing activity from private investors, from the kind of whole non-DFI side of things. And it has been growing and expected to continue to grow. And this includes corporates, which are, corporate venturing is sort of one sort of interesting area within that space that we can talk more about. And I wanted to also just mention that the private investors tend to have a little bit more flexibility in how they transact, and they can bring kind of expertise and know-how in addition to the capital to the deals. So it's an interesting opportunity there. Investors often note the limited financial and operational capacity of enterprises, that they would like to invest in potential investees. And many are finding that if they can strategically use technical assistance before and also during the investment, it helps out in a number of ways. I mean, taking a hands-on approach can actually sort of double as your due diligence if you're sort of assessing a business along the way and you're sort of providing them some inputs and support. And then also there are third-party TA providers that you can tap into for either more specialized things or if you don't have the capacity in-house or you're not taking that kind of a hands-on approach. Third, the need for some sort of local presence for deal flow and also timely due diligence, and maybe I'd add just kind of timely response to your investees as well. So I think often it's noted that a lot of the capital is coming from far from where it's going to be invested geographically, and this creates issues with finding the right deals to make and also building trust with your investees and navigating the regulatory environments, which can be complex across the continent. So I think that some investors are finding different types of local partnership, whether it's co-investment or working through a fund manager or another intermediary like an accelerator, can help to kind of bridge that gap between the sources of capital and the deal opportunities on the ground. Fourth, the limited availability of capital for early stage businesses is another theme that I think has been actually coming up quite a lot throughout the conference and other sessions that I've been in. And if you think about kind of related to this, the types of instruments that we saw, I think almost all of the capital has been deployed through straight debt or straight equity. And there's not much use being made of different types of investment structures or of different types of investment instruments that might combine some of the features of debt and equity. So this could look like revenue sharing debt or convertibles, et cetera, or even a capital stack that includes first loss investors who can kind of change the risk characteristics of the deal. Especially for what tends to be perceived as riskier with early stage. So I'm going to pause there. I'll make a plug again on our website where you can find not only all the reports that I've talked about, but also lots of other resources. You can find more information on all of the other GEN programs that I mentioned and on our members and membership. You can of course contact me and also Rachel, who I pointed out, with questions about the research. And what I want to do now is basically invite 3 different practitioners up to share just 5 to 7 minutes of wisdom from their own experience and kind of relate it to the findings here so that we can really start to think of how does this come to life? How does this happen when you're really on the ground sort of trying to work? So I'll leave up this slide so that in case it's going to be referred to, and also just as a kind of heads up, the small groups that we break into will fall out along these 4 categories. So we'll have 2 tables that are each discussing one of these.
So I started here in the region about 8 years ago, starting the solar business in Uganda, then moved to Kenya. Ran it for a total of 6 years and exited a year ago from the operations. So I've been raising impact funds for a long time, going around investors, and one of the first findings that local capital is hard to find is obviously something we encountered. The first capital we raised was by MIC4, a very early stage crowdfunding platform in Uganda. It took us, I think, a week or so to raise $15,000. It was very exciting. After that, it became a bit more difficult, but we did a lot with Kiva later on and raised probably a couple $1 million over the course of a couple of years. So even if you're here, you could still go into the world and raise money from people in other places. Now, Kiva is not really a commercial finance, so that might not be the full story. Currently, I moved over to the dark side on the investors' seat now since about a year. I've been working with a group called TBL. TBL Mirror Fund has been a private equity fund here in Kenya, which has been appointed, has closed one fund and has been appointed to manage a fund on behalf of Safaricom, which is the largest telco here. And they started a corporate venture fund 2 years ago. 2 years ago, they launched the idea. It was launched a year and a half ago. And what is the idea behind that? Now, I think it's interesting in the context of this because it addresses kind of a lot of points. Obviously, first of all, it's local capital that moves into businesses. Secondly, it addresses the problem of small ticket sizes not really being available by investors. We invest $100,000 to $250,000, so very little money for for a typical fund manager. So venture capital, there's literally, you can count the number of small venture capital players on the fingers of one hand. And so we added something new, something somewhat new. There's a focus on mobile technology, obviously, but that's, in the context of our fund, it doesn't matter so much. I think the most important thing is that it was clearly established. Also, other studies showed that there's a really missing piece at the bottom. Of course, the missing middle is always there, but middle it can go as low as $50,000. Somebody developing a new app or some kind of application to make business work better. They're not looking for $1 million. They're looking for 100,000, 150. We're currently looking at a company that was started 8 months ago. It's very exciting that you can even consider seriously investing in a company that was just started recently. Yeah, I mean, obviously it's a very exciting and also high risk part of it. Now, by extension, we're looking to raise a bigger fund next to the Safaricom fund, which will then also be able to take the investments, to on-invest after the first investments have been made, so you can grow with the company. I think that's very important as well. So, from the business point of view, so maybe to elaborate a little bit on corporate venture fund, it's very new here. It's not so common. It's more common in Europe and the States, but what it means is Safaricom has allocated, in this case, $1 million into a separate trust that will be managed by us to make a couple of investments, and the fund should be expanded to about $10 million by the end of this year if everything goes well. So what does that bring? So for companies, what it brings them is the potential of a local partner. Safaricom is, in the context of the Kenyan economy, is a complete elephant. It's by far the biggest company in the country, I think. I mean, there might be an oil or mining company, but I think Safaricom it's the biggest company, is everywhere in the economy, is of course famous for M-Pesa, etc., etc. So there's also on the downside to that from the entrepreneurs, everybody, from the entrepreneurs, there's a real fear that ideas will be stolen. They'll be crushed once they gain some traction. So by creating a fund manager in the middle, we hope to keep the elephant and the mosquito a little bit apart, and not have the elephant crush the mosquito too early. But it can also bring good things. It brings a lot of potential PR for a young company with a new idea. It gives them the opportunity to tap into an infrastructure that can be hugely beneficial to them. Even more exciting it gets when they can get some access to some customers. And we see a lot of companies that are developing applications and products that could be very useful for a Safaricom, or you could easily see that a company like Safaricom could hugely leverage that and make it big. So from very small to 2 months later, having the biggest company in the country invested in you and organizing some resources to push you ahead is obviously for some people very promising and exciting idea. I could go on for a long time, but maybe this is a good start. Thank you.
At Open Capital Advisors, we were the lead research partner on the ground for both the East Africa and the Southern Africa study, so happy to answer questions on that as well. But I think for now I'm going to kind of focus on sort of the finding on strategic use of TA, because I think we've spent a lot of time at this conference talking about what technical assistance is, what capacity building is, how that's appropriate for different stages of companies, how that's appropriate for different stages of investors. And I think the most important thing we found throughout the course of this study was that there is a lot of funding available for technical assistance, but the challenge is that it's not always targeted when companies actually need it. And so I think in particular here I want to highlight sort of this use of technical assistance pre-investment, because every investor that we spoke to for this study and for others, and I'm sure this is a common finding, everyone wants more deal flow. Everybody wants more investment-ready opportunities. They want more deal flow. They want more opportunities, but they just feel like the entrepreneurs that they meet aren't yet ready for them to place capital. And so that's a real challenge. So there are a couple of funds that I want to highlight, because I think there are a few that have started to structure things in a way that helps with the post-investment side. So just looking at the The Technical Assistance Fund, TAF, it's implemented by TechnoServe alongside the African Agricultural Fund. They do have a sidecar fund for technical assistance that's been raised alongside the main investment fund. This is an incredibly common structure that a number of funds are using throughout East and Southern Africa. However, almost all of those TA sidecar funds are limited to post-investment opportunities. And so even when a little bit of that funding can be allocated for pre-investment, it's usually 5 to 7% of the TA sidecar funding. So if we do have any folks in here who provide funding to some of these investment funds for their TA sidecars, I'd like to encourage you to start looking pre-investment, because in a lot of ways that'll help you solve not only the investment readiness but also the pipeline challenge, right? So if the funds you're working with don't have pipeline, this is one way to get there. In terms of the way that works well with some of this technical assistance pre-investment, I think that kind of is where it becomes strategic. I'm going to call on you a little bit, Matt. I apologize. Talking about the PACE program for USAID, I think PACE is a $10 million global program to try to accelerate early-stage businesses. And so I think where PACE has been really unique is in starting to look at pre-investment opportunities to support the types of companies that actually do get companies ready for investment. So some of the programming they have here, they funded Dahlberg in South Africa for the Catalyst for Growth program to try to collect additional data on what business development providers are effective. So I think that'll be really interesting to see where that goes over the next couple of years. They've also funded Intellicap, so that's part of Sankalp where we are today, which is really great, as well as some of the other service providers that Intellicap brings into the ecosystem. They also, full disclosure, have funded Open Capital to help us try to think about how we can work with much earlier stage companies than we would otherwise, so companies raising less than $500,000. They've also funded Jibu, which is a water company in Uganda, and a bunch of other initiatives globally that are starting to look at this. And so I think PACE is still in its early stages, but it'll be interesting to see where that pre-investment TA actually takes us over the course of the next couple of years and what that does to build some of the ecosystems where it's operating. I know a number of other DFIs are actually starting to look at this space, so it is a really exciting time, I think, to be working in these markets. I think in terms of kind of takeaways and other things to keep in mind as you're looking at technical assistance and how to use it strategically, I think it's really important to start distinguishing the quality of technical assistance. I think we don't have a lot of ways today to decide whether or not the technical assistance that's provided actually does lead to more investment readiness, does lead to more pipeline investments. Andy and PACE as well are funding the Global Accelerator Learning Initiative, GALI, that's trying to look at that. But some of the limitations that research like that has is that it really only focuses on a specific type of technical assistance or a specific type of pipeline building. So GALI in particular is looking at the accelerator opportunity, which is mostly classroom-based programs. And I think where, again, it comes back to strategic TA and how that can be effective in these markets, that you really have to identify specific opportunities to support companies in very specific and tailored ways. So as we see challenges on the financial and operational capacity, we might need individual consultants who are capable of delivering specific outcomes. So if we're working with a company that needs to understand how to price its products as it moves into Uganda, that's a very specific question that could really change the investment profile for the company. It does look very different than the type of technical assistance that's often provided in markets. I think it's otherwise really critical, and this is not one of the key findings here, but kind of comes back to this idea of local partnerships and local presence that Baldwin discussed. I think it's really important that both the decisions for technical assistance, which companies will support, as well as the investments are actually made locally. So I think it's really encouraging to start seeing more and more investors with companies that are based in the markets where they're operating. So we have more than, I think, 100 investors that are active in East Africa, and about half of them actually have offices here locally, which is really exciting. I think we need to start thinking about the technical assistance going alongside. That is also being made as a local decision.
From reading Rishab's bio, he said he was raised in Ghana. So maybe we'll have some insights on West Africa as well as he. Thank you.
Thank you, and thanks for pronouncing my last name properly. Thanks for having me here. I guess Jen has asked me to represent Grofin over here because we are, in fact, an impact investor. And I think it'll be interesting for me to tell you what that means and how we impact invest, to give you an idea of what this is in the reality. First of all, as an impact investor, at this conference I've heard a lot of people say, what is impact investing? What is impact? How do you measure it, etc.? I really think impact is being very well defined. I actually think it can be measured. I think we do it quite well. We have some tools and resources, whether it's SROI, JIRS, IRIS, etc. But I don't think it's a myth. I think we can I can look at our portfolio and tell you how many students in school we put in, how many patients on beds, how many smallholder farms we invest in, how many women entrepreneurs we invest in, how many jobs we've created. Without the multiplier effect of some 13% or so, I can actually tell you this, and it can be audited by any of our investors. So it can be credibly measured and reported on. So for me, impact is not a myth, and we can report on it. But Grofin is a fund manager and growth financier. We're an impact financier and SME developer. So yes, when we look at an investment, we do look at the impact it could create on the business. We actually use tools within um, our deal scoping to look at how we can actually look at benchmarks to see if this is actually going to be an interesting investment on the impact side. A nice example for this is for every $100,000 that we invest in a growing business, we like to see on average about 12 jobs created. If it falls below, on the portfolio side, we look to make it up with other investments where we invest, where the return on employment is higher than that 12 number of 12 per se. So what I'm trying to say is that impact is measurable, and it needs to be strategic. It needs to be a blended value proposition of your offering to the market, and it should form part of your strategy, the way you shape your investment criteria, etc., and the way you measure and report on it. Now, there are some aspects of impact that I wish we could report on. It's nice to talk about how many jobs we create, how many patients on beds we invest in. But what we don't actually see, and in these markets, because the sample size of our investing is very small, it's really, I make 10 investments a year in Kenya, I have a portfolio of about 35 investments, but really that's tiny. What we really can't report on are some of the anecdotal aspects of the impact of our investment. What we're trying to do at Grofin, really more as part of our initiative to develop our company culture, is to actually communicate the anecdotal side of impact investing. Those jobs that we create, we don't really report to our investors that companies are actually hiring ladies who were prostitutes because they're very good at customer service. Taking them out of that sector into another one. We don't really report that the production, the manufacturing investment we made in Rwanda, which failed. Actually, we needed to invest in transformers to actually ensure efficient power supply, and actually the community around that area has light, 24 hours a day. We don't know the numbers of students that are able to read at night, etc. It's all anecdotal. We can measure how many jobs are created, etc. There are many stories like this that we could tell. We communicate this, internally. We're trying to look at ways in which we can actually work with the bodies like IRIS and JIRS to actually see how can we actually communicate these stories. Because the stories go. At the end of the day, we're reporting on numbers of students, numbers of smallholders, but the real story of the impact that we're making is something interesting that also needs to come out to give us some kind of, to validate why we're actually working in this sector and doing this. And it's not just about, it's nice to see those numbers and to report on them, but also nice to know the message of this impact at the very end of the day. Furthermore, I'd like to tell you how we make these investments in this impact sector. And Hannah had talked about some of the instruments, expanding use of different investment structures, etc. So our focus is very much in the SGB space, small and growing business space. We don't expect these businesses to IPO or to have some form of a strategic exit or sale. So there's not going to be a very hyped up liquidity event. These are small businesses that, whether they're a school or they're a small clinic or they're a diagnostic center or maybe a small hotel, or you get what I'm saying. When we try to structure an investment product into these businesses, the first thing that the entrepreneur asks for is, like, if we're looking for an equity investor, we want somebody strategic that can give us equity, we need patient capital, etc. we have to communicate to them, to explain to them that equity financing is really the most expensive form of financing that they can take on. They don't see this. They see this as the most patient structure. They don't understand the mechanisms of how debt can add a tax shield to their business, how they can afford debt out of their cash flows, a flexible debt product. It's probably the better way to go. Of course, we don't invest in businesses that we don't think can sustain debt repayments. But the methodology in which we use is to look at a very flexible form of structuring debt that actually commands equity returns. Because as a matter of fact, we're actually taking equity risk and trying to place debt. Some of the products, you've heard the term quasi-equity, you've heard the term mezzanine, you've heard the term royalties, incentives. Maybe an interesting example on how we can actually be flexible enough to structure some of these lower price debt instruments and more higher yield equity instruments into these businesses would be worthwhile. A school we invested in, this was actually a startup investment in Nairobi some 4 years ago. Seasoned promoter, had the right background, had the right ideals, had the right vision, etc. We supported her to start a school in Nairobi, in the Lavington area. Being a startup, we looked at how could we structure the right kind of investment, $750,000 investment into a school, and not burden the balance sheet with to feed off the cash flows to pay the debt structure. The last thing we want to do is to inject debt into a company, and when the repayment begins, they're paying us back with the money that we put in. It's happened before. It still happens. So we look at the way in which we can instill moratoriums. We can instill flexible payment structures, maybe stage the repayment behavior at later dates when we believe the class size will be larger and we'll be able to accommodate more debt repayment. But a very interesting, let's call it a royalty instrument that we plugged in order to manage the interest rate low and to look at somewhat of a kicker, is we said that for every new student that you take on, you will pay Grofin an additional 10,000 shillings per term. So what did the promoter do? She actually factored this into the fee of the school. It's a middle class school. They were looking at 120,000 shillings per term per student. She made it 130,000 shillings to incorporate that in as a structure. She started off with 20 students. And after August, when it came September, she added another 40 students. Yet come January, she added another 40 students. Within a year and a half's time, she was at capacity of 200 students. 200 students times 10,000 shillings per term is a nice few million shillings in terms of a kicker. In order for us to actually price the risk and get the return back in an innovative way. Okay. I hope I've touched on the structuring side of things in each way. But eventually, what I'm trying to say is the nature of these small and growing businesses that we like to put capital into and also see the economic sustainable returns as well as the impact returns, there needs to be more of a self-liquidating structure. And over the term, 4 to 5 years, sometimes 6 years, eventually the loan or the debt will actually be liquidated completely. I think that is a premise